So the next function that you have on your camera to control the image exposure is the shutter speed. And basically the shutter speed is the overall time that each frame is exposed for. Okay, so you can have 100th of a second, 200th of a second, 300th, 400th, and so on. So that's saying that you're letting in a certain amount of light only for that certain amount of time. So your aperture is controlling how much light is going into the camera, and your shutter speed is controlling how fast that shutter is opening and closing. And this story, or an example that I heard that I'll never forget, is imagine that you have barn doors on a farm, right? Or on a farmhouse, whatever, on a dairy, on a farm somewhere where there's cows. And the barn doors that open, imagine that is the aperture of the camera. So if you have wide open the barn doors, you're gonna let a large amount of cows, let's say the cows are the light photons that are entering the sensor through the camera, a wide barn doors or a wide aperture is gonna let in more light photon cows into the barn. Now imagine the shutter speed is the speed at which the barn doors open and close. So if you have a slow shutter speed, you're gonna be able to let a lot of cows into that barn. But if you have a fast shutter speed, like 100th or 200th of a second, there's not many cows that are gonna get into that barn. So each shutter speed has its own effect, and each f-stop has its own effect too. So the higher the shutter speed, the less the dragging or the blurring there is on each exposed frame. So let's say you have a slower shutter speed. The slower the shutter speed, the more motion blur that there's gonna be, the softer the image is gonna be too. Generally, in cinematic film, film that you see in the movie theater, the shutter speed is double the frame rate. The reason is that this creates a more natural kind of blur that mimics the blur that the eye experiences. So it's easier to look at, it's more pleasing to the eye. So if you're shooting at 24 frames a second, the kind of standard for a natural film look would be a 50th of a second for the shutter speed. Now if you want to move away from that natural look and get more of that kind of HD, high definition, possibly action, sports stuff, you use a higher shutter speed because there's going to be less blurry. So in more of like Born Identity, definitely Saving Private Ryan has an amazing example in that rain sequence where you can really feel that strobiness and that kind of war-like, ultra-realistic feel. Now, if they would have went with a slower shutter speed, it would have had a totally different effect on the audience. It would have been that much more cinematic, calming, but having that high shutter speed creates just that kind of ultra-high definition look and feel, which can work for your film or can work against your film. So knowing how you want to affect your audience is going to help you decide on that. So with that said, if you're looking for that cinematic look and feel, you're going to want your shutter speed to double your frame rate. If you're shooting at 24 frames a second, you're going to want to have your shutter speed at a 50th of a second. If you're shooting action or you're shooting something you want to look ultra realistic where you can see all the definition and it doesn't have that motion blur, each frame is a clean image, you're going to want to bump up the shutter speed a much higher.